The radio crackled with static across the pre-dawn darkness of Kandahar airfield. Captain Raven Deadstick Kowalski pressed her headset closer, straining to catch the fragmented transmission bleeding through the interference. What she heard made her blood run cold. Mayday, Mayday, Phoenix 17, multiple casualties, Grid 4789, enemy armor advancing. Request immediate close air support. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Shark Rivera, the SEAL team leader who'd laughed at her during yesterday's mission briefing. His exact words echoed in her memory. "Air power's finished, Captain. This is ground pounder's work now. Maybe stick to the flight sim." The other operators had chuckled, their eyes dismissive as they studied her slight frame and the faded patches on her flight suit. 23 years of service, 3 combat tour, and still they saw weakness where steel should be. Now Shark was screaming into his radio, and Raven could hear the desperation cutting through his usual bravado. The transmission died in a wash of static. She glanced at the duty officers' board. Every available aircraft was either grounded for maintenance or already deployed on high-priority missions. The brass had made it clear resources were stretched thin, and non-essential sorties were canceled until further notice. Her A-10C Thunderbolt II, tail number 780681, sat on the tarmac like a forgotten relic. Ugly, slow, and supposedly obsolete according to the Pentagon's latest efficiency reports. But Raven knew something the Pentagon didn't. She knew the sound of dying men, and she'd heard it too many times to ignore it now. Her fingers traced the worn St. Michael pendant hanging from her dog tags, a ritual older than her commission. The pre-flight checklist was already running through her mind, muscle memory from thousands of hours in the cockpit. The base commander's recall order sat prominently displayed on the bulletin board. All non-essential air assets grounded pending resource reallocation assessment. Her A-10 definitely qualified as non-essential in their eyes. The newer F-35s got the glory missions while the Warthogs gathered dust, waiting for some bureaucrat to decide their fate. Thunder rumbled overhead, but the sky was clear. It wasn't weather, it was artillery. Somewhere out there in the Hindu Kush Mountains, American soldiers were fighting for their lives, and the only thing standing between them and catastrophe was one disobedient pilot and her obsolete aircraft. Raven's calloused hands were already reaching for her helmet. The maintenance chief, Staff Sergeant Tommy "Wrench" Nakamura, looked up from his clipboard as her boots hit the tarmac at a dead run. His weathered face creased into a knowing frown. In 20 years of turning wrenches, he'd seen that look before, the expression of a pilot who'd already made a decision that would either save lives or end careers. "Captain, the bird's not on the flight schedule," he called out, but his tone lacked conviction. Wrench had heard the same radio chatter, seen the same distant flashes lighting up the northern horizon. He'd also seen what Deadstick could do with that old warthog when lives were on the line. "Then we're about to make some unscheduled history, Sergeant." Her voice carried the quiet authority that came from surviving impossible odds. 3 years ago, she'd been the pilot who'd stayed on station for 47 minutes while taking small arms fire, providing cover for a medical evacuation in Helmand Province. Last year, she'd landed her damaged A-10 on a highway after taking a rocket-propelled grenade through her left engine, walked away from the wreck, and was flying again within a week. The nickname Deadstick wasn't mockery. It was respect earned through blood and aviation fuel. Wrench's hands were already moving toward the aircraft's maintenance panel. "She's loaded with 30mm and 2 Mavericks from yesterday's canceled sortie, fuel's at 80%. He paused, studying her face in the amber glow of the hangar lights. "Captain, you know this isn't going to end well for either of us." "Maybe not," Raven replied, pulling on her flight gloves with practiced precision. "But it'll end a lot worse for those boys on the ground if we do nothing." She gestured toward the northern mountains where the artillery flashes were intensifying. "Besides, when did doing the right thing ever guarantee a happy ending?" The A-10's engines spooled up with their distinctive whine. a sound that had struck fear into enemy hearts for over 4 decades. As Raven ran through her pre-flight checks, she caught sight of her reflection in the cockpit glass, tired eyes, graying temples, and the deep lines that came from squinting through gun sights at enemies who'd rather see her dead. She looked exactly like what she was, a warrior who'd outlived her welcome in a military obsessed with youth and technology. The radio sparked to life again. Any station, this is Phoenix 17. We are taking heavy fire. Enemy, tanks advancing on our position. Immediate air support requested. The transmission dissolved into static, but the message was clear. Raven's thumb hovered over the taxi clearance button. Once she pressed it, there would be no going back. Tower Control's voice cut through the static. "Deadstick, you are not cleared for takeoff. Return to hangar immediately." The controller sounded young, probably fresh out of training, following protocol to the letter. He had no idea what was happening in the mountains, no concept of the mathematics of modern warfare, that every minute of delay meant more American casualties. "Tower, this is Deadstick. I'm experiencing radio malfunction. Cannot hear your transmission clearly." The lie came easily, practiced from years of bureaucratic navigation. Sometimes the right thing required creative interpretation of regulations. She released the brakes and felt the warthog begin to roll. 30,000 pounds of titanium, weapons, and determination moving toward the active runway. In the distance, she could see the base commander's vehicle racing toward the flight line, emergency lights flashing. Colonel Harrison was probably screaming into his radio, demanding an immediate abort. But orders couldn't travel faster than a determined pilot, and Raven had physics on her side. The twin General Electric TF-34 engines pushed the A-10 down the runway with surprising urgency. For an aircraft often mocked as too slow for modern warfare, the Thunderbolt II accelerated with the steady power of inevitability. At 138 knots, Raven pulled back on the stick, and the old warbird lifted into the Afghan dawn, carrying with it the hopes of dying men and the career of one stubborn pilot. Behind her, Kandahar airfield fell away like a discarded memory. Ahead lay the mountains where courage would be measured not in medals or commendations, but in the simple mathematics of survival. How many Americans would still be breathing when the sun set on another day in an endless war? Raven banked north toward the sound of gunfire, her aircraft's shadow racing across the desert like an omen of deliverance or destruction. The initial climb took her through scattered clouds that hung over the valley like funeral shrouds. At 8,000 feet, she leveled off and switched to the tactical frequency. The radio chatter was chaos, multiple units reporting contact, requests for medical evacuation, and beneath it all, the steady countdown of ammunition running low and casualties mounting. "Phoenix 17, this is Deadstick. I'm inbound your position with close air support. What's your situation?" Her voice cut through the noise with the calm authority of someone who'd flown these missions before the war was old enough to vote. The response was immediate. "Deadstick, this is Shark. Jesus Christ, where did you come from? We've got 3 T-55 tanks advancing from the north, approximately 50 dismounted infantry in support. We're low on ammunition and have multiple wounded. Can you help us?" Gone was the dismissive arrogance from yesterday's briefing. Combat had a way of stripping away pretense, revealing what truly mattered. Shark's voice carried the raw desperation of a leader watching his men die, and for the first time, he sounded genuinely grateful for air power. "Roger, Shark, I have eyes on your smoke. Can you mark the enemy positions?" Affirm, marking with infrared strobe. A brief pause. "Deadstick, I owe you an apology for yesterday." "Save it for the after-action report, Lieutenant Commander. Let's focus on keeping your people alive." Raven rolled the A-10 into a gentle banking turn, bringing the GAU-8 Avenger cannon to bear on the approaching armor. Through her targeting system, she could see the Soviet-era tanks grinding through the rocky terrain with mechanical determination. Outdated by Western standards, but still perfectly capable of killing Americans. The first burst from the 30mm cannon sounded like the world's largest zipper being torn open. 200 rounds of depleted uranium penetrated the lead tank's armor with devastating efficiency. The T-55 shuddered, stopped, and began burning with the distinctive black smoke of cooking ammunition. "Holy shit, deadstick. Direct hit. The other tanks are revering." Shark's voice carried new life, the kind of enthusiasm that came from watching certain death transform into unlikely survival. But Raven knew the battle was far from over. Tank crews rarely traveled alone, and the morning was young. She pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, already scanning for the next threat while keeping one eye on her fuel gauge. The mathematics of aerial warfare were unforgiving. Every minute on station was borrowed time. Every round expended brought her closer to the long flight home. In the distance, she could see more dust clouds stirring along the valley floor. This was going to be a long morning, and before it was over, both she and the SEALs would learn something about the true cost of courage. The second tank erupted in flames as Raven's Maverick missile found its mark, the explosion echoing off the valley walls like thunder. She pulled the Warthog into another climbing turn, scanning for threats while keeping the SEAL position in sight. The morning sun was climbing higher, burning away the desert haze and revealing the full scope of the battlefield below. "Deadstick, we've got movement in the tree line, approximately 200 meters east of the burning tanks. Looks like dismounted infantry setting up a heavy machine gun position." Shark's voice had settled into the professional calm of a seasoned operator, but she could still hear the underlying tension. Through her targeting pod, Raven could make out the distinctive shapes of enemy fighters moving between the sparse vegetation. They were smart, using the terrain for cover while trying to establish a firing position that would dominate the SEAL team's location. Classic small unit tactics, the kind that had been killing American soldiers for 20 years. "I see them, Shark. Keep your heads down." She rolled the A-10 into a shallow dive, lining up for a strafing run. The GAU-8 cannon was a work of art in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities, not just a weapon, but a precision instrument capable of placing devastating firepower exactly where it was needed. Each burst required careful calculation: angle of attack, target lead, friendly positions, collateral damage assessment. It was mathematics written in tracer rounds and measured in lives saved. The cannon's roar filled the cockpit as depleted uranium rounds chewed through the enemy position. Trees exploded into splinters, rocks disintegrated, and the machine gun crew simply ceased to exist. When the dust settled, nothing moved in the tree line. "Outstanding shooting, Deadstick. That's two down, but we're seeing more movement to the west. Looks like a whole company moving up the valley." Raven banked left and immediately spotted them, a column of vehicles and dismounted troops advancing with military precision. Too many for coincidence, too well organized for a chance encounter. This wasn't just a firefight, it was a coordinated attack, and the SEALs had walked into the middle of it. Her fuel gauge was already showing the yellow caution range. The A-10 was built for loitering, but even the most efficient aircraft had limits. She needed to make every shot count, because there wouldn't be time for multiple passes. "Shark, you need to prepare for extraction. This is bigger than we thought, and I can't stay on station much longer." "Negative, Deadstick. We've got wounded who can't be moved, and the LZ is too hot for helicopters. We hold here until medevac arrives." It was exactly the answer she'd expected from a SEAL team leader, and exactly the answer that meant she'd be staying until her fuel tanks ran dry. Some decisions wrote themselves. The next 20 minutes unfolded like a deadly chess match played at altitude. Raven methodically worked through the advancing enemy forces, using the A-10's cannon and remaining Maverick to break up their assault. Each pass brought her lower, each engagement burned more fuel, and each radio call from Shark carried updates on wounded teammates and dwindling ammunition. The enemy adapted quickly, spreading out their formations and using handheld surface-to-air missiles to force her higher. She'd already seen two MANPADS launches streak past her cockpit, close enough that she could feel the heat through the armored glass. The A-10 was tough, built to survive ground fire, but it wasn't invincible. Soviet-era Strela missiles had brought down plenty of aircraft over the years. Deadstick, this is Phoenix 17. We've got multiple wounded and we're down to our last magazines. How much longer can you stay on station? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Raven glanced at her fuel gauge, 15 minutes at most, probably less if she had to maneuver aggressively. But 15 minutes might be enough if help was coming. The problem was that help wasn't coming. Every available asset was committed elsewhere, and the cavalry existed only in old movies. I'm good for a few more passes, Shark. Hang tight. The lie came easily, born from 23 years of military service, and the understanding that sometimes hope mattered more than truth. She'd stay until the engines flamed out if necessary, because walking away wasn't an option, not when American lives hung in the balance. Another missile streaked past her cockpit, close enough to rattle the airframe. The fuel warning light blinked to life as Raven lined up for what she knew would be her final attack run. The enemy had regrouped in a defensive position that commanded the entire valley, and the SEALs were pinned down behind inadequate cover. Mathematics and physics were converging toward an inevitable conclusion. She had enough fuel for one more pass, maybe two, if she pushed the engines to their limits. Shark, I'm Winchester on missiles and down to my last gun runs. You need to be ready to move when I create an opening. Roger, Deadstick, will be ready. But even as she spoke the words, Raven could see the futility of the situation. The enemy position was too strong, the SEAL team too outnumbered. One more strafing run might buy them minutes, but it wouldn't change the fundamental arithmetic of the battlefield. Without resupply or reinforcement, Phoenix 17 was living on borrowed time. She pushed the stick forward, diving toward the enemy position with the fatalistic determination of a pilot who'd already calculated the odds and found them wanting. The GAU-8 cannon spun up to firing speed, its electric whine audible even over the engine noise. Through her heads-up display, she could see the targeting reticle settling on the enemy's strongpoint, and beyond it, the thin line of American defenders who'd trusted her to keep them alive. The cannon thundered its mechanical song, depleted uranium rounds chewing through enemy positions with surgical precision. She held the trigger down longer than tactically advisable, expending ammunition at a rate that would have horrified any accounting officer, but was exactly what the situation demanded. When the gun fell silent, the enemy position had been reduced to smoking crater and scattered debris. Outstanding, outstanding, the bastards are falling back. Shark's voice crackled with renewed hope, but Raven was already calculating the cost of her Pyrrhic victory. Fuel state, critical, ammunition, exhausted, enemy reinforcements, still advancing. She pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn, scanning the valley for additional threats while her engines drank the last drops of aviation fuel. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. She could make it back to Kandahar if she left immediately, climbing to altitude and flying the most efficient route home. Or she could stay on station and watch her aircraft become very expensive lawn decorations somewhere in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Deadstick, this is Shark. We can see more vehicles approaching from the south. How copy? Raven looked at her fuel gauge, then at the distant dust cloud that marked the approaching enemy column. The decision wrote itself in fuel flow calculations and trajectory analysis. She had perhaps 5 minutes of loiter time remaining, not nearly enough to engage another enemy force, but exactly enough to provide reconnaissance and moral support while brave men prepared to die. I copy, Shark. I'll stay on station as long as possible. It wasn't bravado or heroism. It was simple arithmetic. The SEALs needed her eyes and her radio more than the Air Force needed another perfectly functioning A-10. Some equations balanced themselves. The approaching column resolved into individual vehicles through her targeting pod. 3 more T-55 tanks, multiple troop carriers, and what looked like a mobile anti-aircraft system. Professional military forces with professional equipment, not the ragtag insurgents that usually populated these valleys. Someone had planned this operation carefully, and the SEALs had walked into a trap designed specifically for American Special Operations Forces. Shark, you've got 3 tanks and multiple APCs inbound from the south. I count at least 50 dismounted infantry, plus mobile air defense. This is a coordinated attack. Roger, Deadstick. We're moving to secondary positions, but we're running low on everything: ammunition, medical supplies, hope. A pause filled with static and distant gunfire. Listen, Captain. Whatever happens here, I want you to know that you're the reason we're still alive. Yesterday, I was wrong about air power. I was wrong about you. The fuel warning alarm began its insistent beeping, each electronic chirp marking another step toward the inevitable. Raven silenced the alarm and began her final calculations. She could glide the A-10 approximately 40 nautical miles from her current altitude, which put Kandahar Airfield just within theoretical range if she started immediately. But theory and practice were different things, especially when the aircraft in question had been designed 40 years ago and maintained by overworked mechanics using salvaged parts. Shark, I need to RTB for fuel and ammunition. I'll be back as soon as possible with everything I can carry. Negative, Deadstick. Don't come back. This LZ is going to be overrun within the hour, and we can't risk losing another aircraft. You've done more than enough. The words hit her like anti-aircraft fire, sharp and sudden, and designed to bring her down. In 23 years of military service, she'd never abandoned a mission or left friendlies in contact. The idea of flying home while American soldiers died violated every principle she'd sworn to uphold when she'd first raised her right hand and promised to support and defend. But Lieutenant Commander Rivera wasn't asking her to abandon them. He was ordering her to live. The distinction mattered, even if the result was the same. Understood, Phoenix 17. Good luck down there. She banked the A-10 toward home, climbing to conserve fuel while every instinct screamed at her to turn around. Behind her, the radio chatter continued: status reports, casualty updates, and the steady countdown of men preparing to make their final stand in a forgotten valley of a forgotten war. The flight back to Kandahar passed in mechanical routine, punctuated by fuel calculations and radio silence. Raven maintained optimal glide angle and engine settings, nursing every drop of remaining aviation fuel while her mind replayed the morning's engagement. She'd done everything right tactically, but tactics were insufficient when facing strategic reality. The SEALs were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of time, while she was flying home with empty weapons pylons and a nearly empty fuel tank. The contradiction felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. 23 years of training and experience, thousands of hours of flight time, millions of dollars in aircraft and weapon systems, all rendered meaningless by the simple mathematics of logistics and enemy determination. Kandahar Airfield appeared on the horizon like a mirage, shimmering in the morning heat. The control tower was undoubtedly tracking her approach, calculating her flight path and fuel state with electronic precision. By now, Colonel Harrison would know about her unauthorized sortie, and career-ending paperwork was probably already being prepared. But paperwork seemed insignificant compared to the radio silence from Phoenix 17. She'd lost contact with Shark's team 20 minutes ago. Either their radio had been damaged, or there was no one left to operate it. The landing pattern felt surreal after the morning's combat. Normal traffic continued around the airfield, transport planes delivering supplies, helicopters conducting routine maintenance flights, fighter jets returning from scheduled patrols. The war continued its bureaucratic rhythm, indifferent to the small tragedy playing out in the northern mountains. Raven touched down with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining, the A-10's engines flaming out as she rolled toward the parking area. Staff Sergeant Nakamura was waiting with the maintenance crew, their expressions carefully neutral. They'd heard the radio chatter, seen the empty weapons pylons, and understood the mathematics of the morning's mission. "How'd she perform, Captain?" Wrench asked, running his hands over the aircraft's battle-scarred titanium skin. "Like she always does, Sergeant, like she always does." Colonel Harrison's staff car was already approaching across the tarmac, its occupant undoubtedly carrying official displeasure and unofficial consequences. Raven removed her helmet and walked toward whatever came next, her mind still filled with the sound of distant gunfire and unanswered radio calls. Behind her, the old A-10 ticked and groaned as its engines cooled, another mission logged in its maintenance records. Tomorrow, there would be other sorties, other emergencies, other chances to matter. But this morning belonged to Phoenix 17, and their silence spoke louder than any official commendation. The war would continue with its endless appetite for young lives and old aircraft, while in a distant valley, American soldiers had learned the true value of air power, and one stubborn pilot who'd refused to follow orders. Colonel Harrison emerged from his staff car with the measured stride of a career officer facing an unpalatable duty. His expression carried the particular blend of frustration and resignation that came from commanding pilots during wartime, intelligent, dedicated professionals who occasionally allowed conscience to override common sense. He'd been expecting this conversation since the moment Raven's A-10 had lifted off without authorization. "Captain Kowalski," he began, his voice carrying parade ground formality, "you are aware that you violated a direct order and committed an aircraft to unauthorized combat operations." "Yes, sir." "You understand that this action represents gross insubordination and misuse of military assets." "I understand that's how it appears in the paperwork, sir." Harrison studied her face, searching for signs of remorse or regret. Instead, he found the steady gaze of a veteran who'd made peace with difficult decisions. Her flight suit bore the stains of combat sweat and stress, while her eyes held the particular exhaustion that came from watching good people die despite your best efforts. "Captain, I've been in command for 18 months. In that time, I've seen decorated officers destroy their careers over similar incidents. The regulations exist for good reasons, and exceptions cannot be made based on individual judgment, regardless of intentions." Raven nodded, understanding the position he was in. Harrison was a good officer trapped by the machinery of military bureaucracy, forced to punish actions that his conscience probably applauded. The system demanded accountability, even when accountability conflicted with effectiveness. "However," Harrison continued, his voice softening slightly, "I've also been monitoring the tactical frequency this morning. Phoenix 17 managed to extract 2 hours ago, and Lieutenant Commander Rivera specifically requested that his after-action report reflect the decisive impact of close air support on their mission success." The words hit Raven like unexpected turbulence. "They made it out, sir." "Barely, 3 KIA, multiple wounded, but the team is intact. Rivera's preliminary report states that without your intervention, Phoenix 17 would have been completely overrun." Harrison paused, consulting his notes. He also mentioned something about owing air power an apology. Relief flooded through her like fuel into empty tanks. The SEALs had survived, which meant the morning's mathematics had balanced in favor of the good guys. Everything else, career consequences, regulatory violations, official displeasure, seemed manageable compared to that fundamental equation. "Sir, I accept full responsibility for my actions and any consequences that follow." "I'm sure you do, Captain. But before we discuss consequences, there's something else you should know. Approximately 30 minutes after your return, We received a priority message from CENTCOM. Intelligence indicates that this morning's engagement was part of a larger enemy operation designed to eliminate American special operations capabilities in the region. Phoenix 17's survival has provided crucial intelligence about enemy tactics and organization. Harrison closed his notebook and studied Raven with the calculating gaze of a commander reassessing initial conclusions. It appears that your insubordination may have accidentally served strategic interests, which creates an interesting administrative challenge. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another vehicle, this one bearing the distinctive markings of a medical transport. Through its windows, Raven could see bandaged figures in desert camouflage, Phoenix 17, returning from their brush with eternity. The vehicle stopped near the aircraft parking area, and Lieutenant Commander Rivera emerged, his left arm in a sling and his face bearing the haggard expression of someone who'd survived the impossible. He walked directly toward them, his gait stiff but determined. When he reached speaking distance, he stopped and rendered a crisp salute, not to Colonel Harrison, but to Captain Raven Kowalski. "Ma'am, Phoenix 17 requests permission to thank the pilot who saved our lives this morning." Raven returned the salute, feeling the weight of 23 years of service crystallize into this single moment of recognition. "Permission granted, Lieutenant Commander." "Captain, yesterday I said air power was finished. I said this was ground pounders' work. I was wrong on both counts, and my team is alive because you proved it." Rivera's voice carried the hoarse quality that came from hours of shouting orders over gunfire. "You flew an unauthorized mission, disobeyed direct orders, and risked your career to save people who'd insulted your capabilities. That's not just professional excellence, that's honor." Colonel Harrison observed this exchange with the expression of an officer whose carefully prepared speech had suddenly become irrelevant. Military justice operated on precedent and regulation, but it also recognized that some situations transcended normal administrative categories. This morning's events belonged in that exceptional category. "Captain Kowalski," Harrison said finally, "report to my office at 1400 hours for administrative review of this morning's activities. Bring your flight logs and maintenance records." It wasn't quite an exoneration, but it wasn't a court-martial either. In the ambiguous space between official approval and official condemnation, professional soldiers found room to maneuver. The meeting would happen, paperwork would be filed, and official records would reflect something appropriately bureaucratic. But everyone present understood the real story. Sometimes doing the right thing required breaking the right rules. As Rivera returned to the medical transport, he paused and looked back. "Captain, if you ever need a ground team, Phoenix 17 volunteers for the mission. We've learned something about air-ground cooperation this morning." The vehicle departed, leaving Raven and Harrison alone on the tarmac with an old and the echoes of the morning's lessons. In the distance, other aircraft continued their routine operations, while the war ground forward with its inexorable appetite for both heroism and tragedy. "Captain," Harrison said quietly, "for the record, I never want to have this conversation again." "Understood, sir. However, also for the record, I'm glad Phoenix 17 made it home." He returned to his staff car, leaving Raven alone with her aircraft and her thoughts. The A-10 sat motionless in the afternoon heat, its weapons pylons empty but its mission complete. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new emergencies, and new opportunities to matter. But this morning would remain, crystallized in memory and official reports, as the day when an old aircraft and an older pilot proved that some things never went out of style. Staff Sergeant Nakamura approached with his maintenance checklist, ready to prepare the Warthog for its next mission. The cycle would continue: fuel, weapons, takeoff, landing, maintenance. The eternal rhythm of military aviation. But now it carried different weight, bearing the knowledge that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that weren't officially authorized. In the Hindu Kush Mountains, Enemy forces were withdrawing and regrouping, having learned their own lessons about American air power. The larger war would continue, but this morning's mathematics had been settled decisively. Phoenix 17 had survived, Deadstick had proven her worth, and an old A-10 had reminded everyone that obituaries for air power were premature. The sun climbed higher over Kandahar airfield, burning away the morning's confusion and leaving behind clarity. Courage couldn't be regulated, honor couldn't be scheduled, and sometimes the most important victories happened when nobody was officially watching. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line as news of the morning's engagement spread through unofficial channels. Military bases were gossip ecosystems where heroism traveled faster than official reports, and by 1300 hours, everyone from maintenance crews to mess hall staff knew about Captain Kowalski's unauthorized mission and Phoenix 17's dramatic survival. Raven sat in the pilot's lounge, nursing coffee that tasted like liquid maintenance fluid while reviewing her flight logs before the administrative meeting. The numbers told a precise story: fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, flight duration, and enemy casualties. But they couldn't capture the weight of decision-making at altitude, the pressure of keeping American soldiers alive, or the lonely mathematics of disobedience. Her solitude was interrupted by the arrival of Major Jessica Viper Torres, the squadron's operations officer and Raven's closest friend. Viper had earned her callsign through aggressive flying and sharper tactics, but today her expression carried uncharacteristic concern. "Deadstick, what the hell were you thinking this morning?" "I was thinking about Phoenix 17 dying in a valley, while we sat here following regulations." Viper slumped into the adjacent chair, her flight suit bearing the fresh sweat stains of a recent sortie. "You know Harrison's been fielding calls from Bagram all afternoon. Word is that some colonel up there is demanding a full investigation into unauthorized aircraft deployment." The news wasn't surprising. Military bureaucracy operated on institutional momentum, and unauthorized actions created ripples that eventually reached someone important enough to demand accountability. Raven had known this morning that saving Phoenix 17 might cost her career, and that equation hadn't changed. "Jess, if you were in my position, hearing those SEALs calling for help, what would you have done?" Viper studied her friend's face, seeing the fatigue lines that marked every combat pilot, but also something else: the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd acted according to their deepest principles. "Honestly, probably the same thing, but I'm not sure I'd have the guts to actually launch without authorization." It wasn't about guts. It was about mathematics. Phoenix 17 needed immediate close air support, and I was the only asset available. Everything else was just paperwork. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of another pilot, Captain Marcus "Ghost" Williams, recently arrived from stateside and still carrying the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't yet learned the true cost of warfare. His flight suit bore new insignia and clean patches, marking him as fresh meat in the seasoned predator environment of combat aviation. "Captain Kowalski, I heard about your mission this morning. That was incredible flying. How did you manage to stay on station so long with limited fuel?" Raven looked at the young pilot, seeing herself 20 years earlier, eager, confident, and blissfully unaware of how war stripped away illusions like desert wind eroding stone. "Experience, Captain. You learn to make every shot count and every gallon matter. I've been studying close air support tactics since I arrived, but the manuals don't really cover unauthorized missions. Were you worried about the consequences?" The question hung in the air like ordnance waiting to detonate. Viper shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the dangerous territory the conversation was entering. Young pilots needed heroes and role models, but they also needed to understand that heroism often carried prices that couldn't be calculated until after the bill came due. "Ghost, let me give you some advice that they don't teach in flight school," Raven said carefully. Every pilot faces moments where regulations conflict with conscience. When that happens, you have to decide what kind of officer you want to be. But you also have to be prepared to live with the consequences of that decision. But surely saving American lives justifies breaking regulations. That's not for me to decide. That's why we're having an administrative review this afternoon. Williams looked confused, as if the mathematics of military justice were more complex than flight dynamics. Viper rescued him from further philosophical inquiry by suggesting he review the afternoon flight schedule, leaving the two senior pilots alone with their coffee and contemplation. "You know he's going to try to emulate you," Viper said after Williams departed. "Then I need to make sure he understands the difference between calculated risk and reckless stupidity. This morning worked out because I had 23 years of experience to draw on. A new pilot might not be so lucky." The observation carried weight beyond its immediate context. Military culture perpetuated itself through stories and examples, turning individual actions into institutional legends. Raven's unauthorized mission would become part of squadron lore, inspiring future pilots while potentially encouraging similar acts of creative insubordination. At 13:55 hours, she gathered her materials and walked toward Colonel Harrison's office, passing maintenance crews who nodded respectfully and operations staff who watched with carefully neutral expressions. The administrative machinery of military justice was engaging, and everyone wanted to observe its operation while maintaining appropriate distance from potential consequences. The colonel's office occupied a Quonset hut that had been converted into command space, its walls decorated with unit histories, operational maps, and photographs of aircraft that had served.